Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a solo episode, and I have a topic I want to dive into. It is basically around carbs, right? Should you go higher or lower carb, and some things that are going to impact that. So this is actually the first episode recording of 2025. By now, I've already had a couple episodes out, but I hope everyone's new year is off to a great start, and you are at least starting to work on the goals you had set for the year. So let's dive into it. So higher or lower carbs? I think this is a pretty timely topic, right? I think a lot of this time of year, a lot of people are weight loss focused. And one of the main things they're going to do is cut out their carbs. And to give you a little backstory here, for myself, you would always hear, hey, you need to cut out carbs to lose weight. And when I first got into the fitness industry, it was like, oh, that was such a bad idea. You need carbs. You should eat plenty of carbs. And I felt there's one side that people are like, carbs are terrible. And there's the other side where people are like, carbs are amazing. You should have as many carbs as you want. And again, with most things, anytime there's those extremes, usually somewhere in the middle, there's the right answer, right? And this carb talk is no different. But I was always on the higher carbs. Okay, you need carbs. And if anyone wanted to go lower carb, it'd be like, that's just dumb. Why would you do that? You don't need to do that. But again, I think there are times and situations where lower carb can work. Now, what I will say on this is when somebody hears low carb, is they automatically think that means no carbs or a keto diet. And that's not the case, right? That is another kind of issue here with the carb talk is it's either you're high carb or you're low carb. And if you're low carb, it's keto and no carbs. And again, that's not the case. There's a lot of in between there that we can settle on. And before I kind of dive into this kind of, hey, carbs are awesome, you should have carbs thought process, I feel like also led to in the fitness space and kind of the physique kind of world of fats end up being super low and we end up missing out on some of the benefits of having fats. And again, I think the fat choices are important as well too, right? A lot of people miss out on good fats, right? Like from fatty fish, olives, olive oil, avocado, fats like nuts, stuff like that. And again, people shy away from them because they are more calorie dense, but they do have a ton of benefits there for that. So again, I think the very first thing that we want to dive into here is low carb does not mean keto or no carbs, right? There's a whole wide range of spectrum there in terms of carbohydrates amounts that we can have. So again, we need to stop thinking kind of black and white. But what I want to do here in this episode is the amount of carbs you eat should depend on three key factors, right? So we're going to dive into what those are. So again, like I said, first, low carb does not equal no carbs or keto. There's everything in between there, right? So again, like it can be a low carb diet could be anywhere from 50 grams of carbs to 100 grams. It just really depends on your body weight and everything like that. And that's the last kind of point I want to make here before we dive into this is the exact carb number is going to be relative to your body weight. So again, there's no universal, hey, you should have this amount of carbs. It's going to be based on your body weight and in your calories. Because like I just said there, for somebody, 100 grams of carbs could be a moderate amount of carbs. It could be low. It could be a little bit more moderate. I would say 100 grams of carbs usually is just going to end up being moderate at best for most people. But for somebody, it could be very low. So again, it's all going to be dependent on your calories and your body weight. All right. So what are going to be the things that are going to impact our carb intake? So again, before we get into these, kind of where we're at now is it was on the, hey, there's really no time where you should be low carb. And I've changed my mind on that where again, there are instances where carbs are going to be something that we can manipulate. And there's cases where it can be a little bit lower here. It is going to be dependent on that. All right. So what are going to be the factors? So the very first one is going to be our activity levels. The more active you are, the higher your carbs should be. So if we're more active, a higher carbohydrate intake is going to suit you well. The less active you are, the lower your carbs need to be. So if you're not very active, let's say you're moving less than 4,000 steps per day, you just maybe weight training a couple times a week, it's like your need for carbohydrates is so low. Whereas someone who moves 10,000 steps a day, maybe they do a couple cardio sessions on top of that, and they do weight training sessions, their need for carbohydrates are going to go up. So again, the first thing we want to look at is what are our activity levels? Because that's going to be the first thing that's going to determine where they should be. And again, that's that nuance and context that is important. And if someone just says, hey, you should go high carbs or you should go low carbs, they're not taking into consideration your activity levels. Again, generally speaking, think about your week, your movement. If you just sit at a desk all day, you get 5,000 steps, you work out 3 times a week, you probably don't really need that many carbohydrates. Again, the more activity you do, it's like you're going to need more carbs. And so that's going to give you that, I don't want to say permission slip, but it's going to give you that permission slip to consume more carbs. Next is going to be your calorie amount. Okay, so certain phases are going to lend themselves to higher or lower carb amounts. So generally speaking, the more calories you have overall, you're probably going to have more carbohydrates, right? It makes sense. Maybe you're in a phase where you're at maintenance, or maybe you're in a small surplus. That's probably going to lend itself to more carbohydrates because again, you're just going to have more calories to work with. Whereas if we're in a fat loss phase and we are eating fewer calories, that's going to be less carbs. So again, it's going to be dependent on the phase that we are in. Because if we think about this, macros make up the calories, right? If you want to go higher protein, but keep your calories the same, you have to drop it from carbs or fats. So if we go into a fat loss phase, we have to cut calories. What are the things that those carbohydrates are, that those calories are going to come from? We want to make sure we keep protein at a pretty good level from a body composition standpoint. So we're not going to really cut any, we shouldn't cut any from protein. We need to have a minimum amount of fats, which I'm going to go over. So we have to make sure we hit that threshold of fats. So with carbohydrates, it is dependent on, like I said, your activity level. And we don't necessarily need carbohydrates where we need that minimum amount of fat and we want that protein from a body mass perspective. So what's the one that's unfortunately going to take a hit? And that's going to be your carbohydrate intake, right? So again, the amount of calories that you're consuming is going to be important here in this process. And again, it depends on the phase training that you're in. And then also, again, it just depends on the amount of calories that you need for whatever phase you're in. Some people, bigger people, and people that genetically have a high energy expenditure, they're going to have a lot more calories to work with in, say, a phase where they're in maybe in a small surplus or maintenance. So they're going to, in most cases, need more carbohydrates in that situation. Where you take someone who just maybe their metabolism genetically is a little bit slower, they're smaller overall, they're just going to have less carbs in that situation there. So again, your calorie amount is going to be super important here in this process. Third, and this one's super important, is body fat levels. The higher your body fat levels are, the less of a need there is for carbs. If you have all that stored energy on your body, and because of that, you really don't need as many carbs if your body fat percentage is higher. The leaner you are, the higher your carb intake can be, and probably should be as you get very lean, because you're going to burn through those a lot quicker, and you're going to need that because again, you don't have as much stored energy on your body, aka body fat. So again, we want to look at body fat levels. You can start to see this picture here where carbohydrate intake may be a little bit lower in situations and when it may be a little bit higher in other situations. Let's talk why the body fat percentage. Obviously I talk about stored energy, but why else? So basically higher body fats, we're going to generally speaking have lower insulin sensitivity, right? So when body fat is higher, insulin sensitivity is often reduced, meaning your body doesn't process carbohydrates as efficiently, okay? So higher insulin levels make it harder to mobilize and burn stored fat, because insulin promotes fat storage and inhibits fat breakdown. So again, that's one reason why we don't want to have higher carbohydrates in this population, right? But on top of it, if we are at higher body fat levels, ideally we would be trying to get that down. So again, that's going to come back to, hey, your calories are going to be lower to lose fat. So then therefore carbohydrates are probably going to be one there. But when we're at lower body fat levels, we have better insulin sensitivity. So again, we handle carbohydrates more effectively here in this process. And again, at this point, the muscles are more likely to use glucose for glycogen replenishment rather than storing it as fats. So again, at those lower body fat levels, more carbohydrates is probably going to be beneficial. Taking this from a metabolic flexibility standpoint, higher carbs when leaner takes advantage of your body's ability to switch between fat and glucose as fuel, right? That's basically metabolic flexibility. And use it as fuel, not to say that's fat burn, you're losing body fat. It's just, hey, what energy, energy source are we using for our energy, right? And again, that doesn't mean that, hey, if we're using fat as fuel, that doesn't mean that we are losing body fat. We still need that energy deficit. In a leaner state, the body prefers to shuttle carbs toward muscle glycogen rather than storing them as fat. When body fat is higher, the priority shifts towards improving fat oxidation by reducing carbs and relying more on fat sources for energy there. Also, the hormonal balance and satiety. So at higher body fat levels, low carb diets can help control hunger hormones and improve satiety by focusing on protein and fats. At lower body fat levels, hormonal shifts often lead to increased hunger and cravings. Adding carbs can help regulate leptin and support recovery from dieting fatigue without risking excessive fat gain. But again, it's also very dependent on our activity and the calories that we're working with. So again, if you are, say you're at higher body fats, but you are very active, that's going to increase your need for carbohydrates, or at least you can at least start to consume a little bit more carbohydrates in that process. All right, so those are the three main things. Now, I did want to add a bonus one real quick, and this is your preference. So some people enjoy higher carb, some enjoy lower carb. Some do better with more carbs, some better with less. And so again, we need to take in the specific person here, right? We can give you all this information, but then if you find that when your carbs dip too low, maybe your energy levels really go down and you just don't really enjoy eating that way. So then maybe for you, our carbohydrate intake would be a little bit higher. Now within reason, and again, making sure it's aligned with our goals. But again, if we're to look at this exact ratio of fat versus carbs, it really just depends on your preference, right? And then some people just do better with higher fat, lower carb. Again, they feel better, their hunger satiety's better, right? and vice versa. So again, we need to take all these things into consideration, preference and everything like that. Now, within that, we still want to make sure we're making good food choices, because all this carbohydrate talk and fat talk is obsolete if we're not also focused on quality of that, right? A lot of times when it comes to carbohydrates, people will demonize carbs, and they're thinking things like cookies and cakes and stuff like that are carbohydrates, when yes, they have carbohydrates in them from sugar, but they're also high in fat as well too, right? The choices we make are also important. I think a lot of times people end up falling on that side when it comes to the carbs. And then on the fats, on the flip side, I was just having this conversation with a client. He said his mom's keto, and so he had a bunch of keto food left over. And so I'm like, okay, what is keto? Because a lot of times people are keto, and of course it was like just it's health market, quote unquote, health marketed stuff that is high fat, like low carb type stuff, right? But it wasn't actual keto. Okay, we're trying to get high fat, like good high fat sources, right? Again, the ones that I mentioned before, right? It's this process type, high fat, low carb, so they can market it as keto, right? So again, our fat sources are important too, because not only do I see that when it comes to keto, but it's also, again, just very high saturated fat intakes, where it's just like super fatty meats, and that's like the bacon, and that's like the only thing that people will consume, and they're missing out on these healthy fats too, right? So again, food choice is super important in this process. All right, so let's talk about how to determine how many carbs you need. So one, we need to figure out your total calories, okay? Or here's how I would go about determining a client's like carbohydrate intake. First, we want to get their total calories figured out. Ideally, for the first 4 to 6 weeks, we're at their maintenance and just figuring out where that's at, so we can establish that baseline. But over time, we'll find that maintenance. But again, it can be super helpful to find that, because then from there, you can start to figure out how many calories you need for fat loss, muscle gain, etc. So the first thing, though, that we want to figure out are your total calories. Where does that fall? Because that is the most important thing at the end of the day, is we need to determine those calories. We could be high carb, low fat, but then from a caloric standpoint, we're not in the energy balance that we want to be in, and it doesn't really matter. So we need to figure out the calories first there before we figure out the macros. Step two, then we want to figure out our protein. All right. So now we have calories figured out. We have protein figured out. Again, protein is going to have 4 calories per gram. So if you did about 1 gram per pound of body weight, and let's say you're 200 pounds, you're looking at, that's going to be 800 calories right there gone. Step three, we want to make sure we get a minimum of at least 30 to 50 grams of fat per day. And this is probably going to be based on your body weight. But again, we want to make sure we get that minimum amount of fat in. Okay. And that's going to come at 9 calories per gram. So let's say, for example, you need 40. So let me do some quick math here. 40 by 9 is 360. So if we're taking this person that is 200 pounds, and let's just say they need 40, again, just giving you a number here, we're at 1,160 calories. That's just math in my head, so I hope I'm right there. So from there, step 4 is the rest can go to carbs, fat, protein, based on what I went over earlier. From this standpoint, now you can figure out, hey, do I want to go higher carbohydrate during this period of time? Again, maybe my activity levels are pretty high. The rest can go to carbohydrates if I want. Maybe I'm also someone who likes carbohydrates. So then maybe I might ramp up carbohydrates. But maybe I'm someone who I like to eat a little bit more protein. So then you add a little bit more protein, and then you can fill the rest in with the carbs and fats that you see fit there with that. But maybe you're someone who likes a little bit higher fat. You also aren't very active. Maybe your body fat levels are a little bit higher. Then you can maybe you can keep carbs fairly low there, right? You can really go wherever you see fit with that. And we'll come up with some kind of numbers here that you can have from that standpoint. So takeaway is calories and protein are by far the most important when it comes to body composition change. And with fats, you need to be at a minimum amount per day. So carbs can be flexible based on goals, lifestyle, and activity levels. So we have some range here. And again, it's going to be very dependent on where we're at. And that's the cool thing too, is you don't have to always be that way. You don't always have to be low carb. And again, remember, low carb isn't no carbs. So you're not going to be able to see this because this is a podcast, but I made a drawing here of, think of carbohydrates on a spectrum, right? We have like very low, we have moderate, and then we have high. Okay. And so very low would be like 20% or less of your caloric intake. 20 to 30% would be low. Moderate would be 30 to 50% of your caloric intake. So again, if we're taking 2,000 calories, that's 1,000 calories from carbohydrates divided by 4. That would be, what's 1,000 divided by 150 grams of carbohydrates. Made that easy on myself. So that's how that would go. So what I'm going to say here is most clients are going to fall in the moderate carb amount. So we're talking 30, 50% of their calories per day. So again, 2,000 calories. If you're at, let's say, a low carbohydrate intake, that's 100 to 150 grams of carbs per day. That would be low. Now, again, if you're eating 1,800 calories a day and 20, 30% is low, then again, you'd probably be closer to 80 to 130 grams of carbs. And then very low would be like 20% or less, really what you see fit there based on all these things that we talked about. And then you can go as high as 65% or higher if you want to, depending on what you do. Now, people that would go 65% or higher carbohydrate intake to me would be someone who's like an endurance runner or something like that. Somebody who have very high levels of activity there. Hopefully that gives you an idea. Hopefully after listening to this, you have a better idea of, hey, it's not just black, or it shouldn't be this black or white thinking of, hey, you should be high carb, you should be low carb. It's very context dependent here. And hopefully this gives you a better idea of where to figure out where your carbohydrate intake should be. If you found this podcast to be helpful, if you could leave a rating and review, and that will help more people find this podcast. If you haven't yet, give me a follow on Instagram, Jeff. That's where I'm most active on social media. If you have any questions on this podcast or any other episodes, just reach out to me. I'm just a DM away. And lastly, if you need to figure out what your carbohydrate intake needs to be for 2025, then my free 30-minute strategy call is for you. The link to that is in the show notes, and we can help figure out what your game plan is for the year, how to figure out where your carbohydrates need to be, and we will go from there. That's it for this episode. Talk to you next time.